In particular, we're talking about free will and foreknowledge. The fact that God knows the future seems to cause a problem for free will. The first step is to be very clear on what the problem is. The Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva goes through this in detail, and he's quite clear how the problem works. We understand free will as making a choice between two alternatives. Each alternative is possible. I have the capability of performing either of them. Which one happens as a result of my choice. The problem with foreknowledge is that it seems to wipe out the alternative I didn't take. I'm choosing between A and B. I choose B. Foreknowledge seems to make A impossible. Foreknowledge is not a case of I chose B and God's knowledge caused me to choose B, forced me to choose B, pushed me to choose B. God's knowledge has nothing to do with my choosing B. It's irrelevant. The problem of foreknowledge pictures God as passive. He just knows, not doing anything. Doesn't picture him as active at all. God's foreknowledge interferes with the path untaken. The other possibility which I didn't choose. And here's how it interferes. I chose B today. Yesterday, God knew I was going to choose B. Well, was A open to me? Under my control? Under my power? Possible for me? What would it mean for me to choose A if God knew yesterday I'm going to choose B? The choice of A would contradict God's knowledge. That's impossible. I can't even have the possibility of choosing A because that would contradict God's knowledge yesterday that I choose B. So God's knowledge yesterday wipes out the alternative I didn't take, which means I wasn't really choosing between two different alternatives because one of them wasn't an alternative. The only thing open to me really was B. And that's not a free choice. That's the problem of foreknowledge and free will. Now we said in the literature, Jewish literature, there are two approaches to this problem. One is to solve it, and the other is to dissolve it. And the solution works this way. The argument that I just presented, that there's a contradiction between God's foreknowledge and my free will, that argument has a hole in it. There's a hole, a mistake. Something's assumed under the table, slipped in without mention. And once we point it out, once we identify it and raise the possibility that it isn't true, the argument dissolves. And here's where the problem is. I'll go back through the argument again. I'll show you where the problem lies. So I think I have two alternatives, A and B. Which one I do is up to me, and I choose B. God yesterday knew I am today choosing B. Then we ask, well, was it really possible for me to choose A? Now, when we ask that question, we're moving from the real world to an imaginary world. In the real world, I do B, and in the real world, yesterday God knew that I did B, that I'm going to do B. We're asking whether another alternative was possible. The alternative is instead of our world where I choose B, there's another world in which I choose A. Is that a possible world? Or is there some contradiction in that world? Okay, now, to generate the contradiction, here's what happens. we start talking about that other world, the other world in which I choose A, and then we say, well, look, in that other world where I choose A, what did God know yesterday? He knew B, see? And since he knew B, therefore there's a contradiction in that other world. Who says that's what he knew yesterday? In the other world, in the imaginary world, in the virtual world. Who told us to keep God's knowledge from yesterday constant when we move from the real world to the virtual world, where we're trying to assess whether the virtual world is possible or is impossible? Maybe when we imagine another world in which I do A instead of B, we should say that in that world, yesterday, God knew that I was going to do A. And then there's no contradiction at all. There are two possible worlds. One is our world where I do B, and yesterday he knew I was going to do B. And the other world, I do A, and yesterday I knew he knew I was going to do A. Who told you to keep the knowledge constant when you move to that other world? The intuitive way to understand this point was made by Bertrand Russell in the beginning of the 20th century, no friend of ours, famous atheist. And he said, if you want to beat up religious people, don't do it this way, because this has an obvious answer. You see, when we talk about God's knowing yesterday what I do today, we didn't ask how he knows. How he knows. Come on, it's God. What do you mean how he knows? Okay, but let's ask it. How does he know? What are the possibilities? And here's one possibility, said Russell. Maybe yesterday he took a sneak peek ahead 24 hours and observed what I do. And he sees me doing B. And that's how he knows yesterday that I do B today. You say taking a sneak peek at the future is hard? Yeah, for you and me. We're talking about God, remember, right? He doesn't have any problems with that. So God gets his knowledge yesterday of what I do today by observing me do it. He watches me do it. So in our world, today I do B, and therefore yesterday he knows that I'm going to do B. If I imagine another world and question its possibility, and I say in this other world, today I do A, you'll have to say, in that world, yesterday he knew A, because that's how he gets his knowledge. He gets his knowledge by observing what I do. And the other world becomes perfectly possible. The argument collapses. The real bottom line philosophically is this: does God's knowledge depend upon what we do or not? That's the real philosophical bottom line. If God's knowledge depends upon what we do, then the argument collapses. Because when you ask, instead of B, which I did do, could I instead have done A? You'll have to build in, of course, if we're imagining the possibility of my doing A, you'll have to build in that under those conditions he knows that I do A, because that's the way he gets his knowledge. And then the argument collapses. So that's the solution to the problem. If you can tolerate the idea that God's knowledge depends upon our action. God's knowledge of our actions depends upon our action. If you can tolerate that idea, then we have a solution, because the argument is not a valid argument. Now let me just point out how some of the strategy works here. Why did we talk about knowledge in the past, foreknowledge? Because intuitively you think the past is over and done. And when I ask, could I, instead of doing B, could I have done A, we're talking about today. So you imagine, here's the world with its whole past, including yesterday, with God's knowledge yesterday, built in. Now we get up to today, and in today I do B, but you're asking, could I have taken this piece out of the today and replaced it with a piece which says I do A? But you're intuitively thinking, I'll replace it and graft it on at the end, leaving everything else the same. You think that because you feel that the past is beyond reach. The past is beyond sensitivity. It's sort of written in stone. But who said so? Who said so? Yes, what comes out of this picture that I'm describing for you is my action today causes God's knowledge yesterday. That may sound odd, weird. Can a later event cause an earlier event? Well, just for your information, philosophers have been working on that proposition for hundreds of years to no avail. No one has been able to show that it's impossible for a later event to cause an earlier event. Worse than that, in physics you have such cases. Richard Feynman and John Wheeler described such cases of particle decay, where one standard and perhaps the cheapest, easiest interpretation is that a later event causes an earlier event. That's within the physical world, where it's extremely difficult. You have all sorts of constraints built into how the physical world works. We're talking about God's relationship to the physical world. So there's not going to be any difficulty there in talking about, in the literature, this is called backwards causation. If you want to look it up, you can look it up. There's gigantic literature on it. So there's no difficulty in saying that my action today causes God's knowledge yesterday. Now I want to do two more things. I want to describe to you the picture that I'm describing in some more detail, and then I want to repeat what I said yesterday about putting God outside of time. There are those who think that putting God outside of time solves the problem. The position I'm describing now says it does not. I'm quoting a tshuva of the Rivosh. Yes, there are people in our literature who say it. I don't understand them. And I'll give you the Rivosh's position. I haven't said it already. I'll put it on directed to the question of being outside of time. So let's think of it this way. We're saying that God gets his knowledge from my action. Step one, God's will fills the whole universe. Everything that exists because of God's immediate will that it should exist. Everything that has the powers that it does, have the powers because of God's immediate will, and it should have the powers that it does. God is not on vacation. This isn't a deist system where he created it and went on vacation. God is intimately involved in everything that happens, including preserving our ability to exercise free will, without which we wouldn't have it. So today, when I choose B, God is present in my choice. He gets the knowledge of my choice from being present in the choice. That's step one. But then, God is also the creator of the whole universe. He's not only present within the creation, he stands outside the creation, as I said 60 seconds ago, and gives it the energy for it to be able to exist. So the knowledge which he acquires from my choice becomes available, so to speak, to his position outside of the whole creation. That's step two. And then step three, since it's available to his position outside of creation, it's available now to all of his other positions in creation, including yesterday. So it's a three-step process. But it starts with my choice. God picks up the knowledge from the choice itself. The knowledge is projected outside, above the timeline, to where God's ultimate position of existence is placed, and then becomes available to other places in the timeline. That's how what I do today can have an effect yesterday. And that's why it's not a contradiction. Because when you move to the other world, you have to hold constant everything else, including how God gets his knowledge. So you imagine a world in which I do A instead of B, it will come out immediately that yesterday God knew A, and there's no contradiction whatsoever. Now, if you put God outside of time, here you have to, it's good to be careful with your language. If you do that, don't apply verbs to God, because verbs are tensed. And you say did, does, that will do, has done, that already implies time. Especially his knowledge. Don't say knows, doesn't know, or learns. Talk about nominally. God's knowledge. There's a certain set of propositions which constitute God's knowledge. And you can talk about what it contains, what it doesn't contain. Right? And then the question will be, does God's knowledge concerning my actions depend upon my actions or not? God's knowledge contains a certain set of propositions. How do they get there? How is it determined what propositions are there or not? If you say that God's knowledge is dependent upon my action, what proposition is in God's knowledge timelessly about what I do today? is dependent upon my action today, then imagining that instead of doing B, I do A, will just mean, under those circumstances, I do A, and God's knowledge contains A. And that's not a contradiction. But if you imagine that God's knowledge is independent of what I do, and in the real world, I do B, and in the real world, his knowledge is that I do B, and then you ask for an imaginary world, if you change my doing B into doing A, there's no reason to change his knowledge, because it's not dependent upon what I do. So then you're going to have the contradiction that in that imaginary world, I do A and God knows B, and that's a contradiction. So everything depends upon this criterion, whether God's knowledge depends upon my action or does not depend upon my action. And if it does, then the whole argument goes down the drain. That's what we said last time. Are we together? I want to make a little sympathy for the proposition, the assumption here, before I describe how Maimonides rejects it. But isn't it funny to make something about God depend upon us? Isn't God totally independent, totally disconnected, totally above, totally transcendent? How could anything about God depend upon us? Well, I think that intuition has to be perhaps weakened to some extent. Think about reward and punishment. Reward and punishment is a cardinal Jewish idea. Scriptures are full of descriptions of reward and punishment. And what that says is, if you do well, you'll be rewarded. And if you do ill, you'll be punished. And God is the one who's rewarding and punishing. So at the very least, the reaction to your actions, which comes from God, depends upon your actions. If you do one thing, you'll get one reaction. If you do another thing, you get another reaction. So it can't be that everything about God is totally transcendent, totally independent, totally self-defined, because the way he set up the creation, some of the things about God that happen are dependent upon what we do. Now, you could make a distinction between what God does and what God knows, which isn't obviously something that he does. You could do that, and then you could reintroduce the question, and you could discuss the question. But it isn't as if it's quite obvious this has got to be wrong, because nothing about God can depend upon us. No, some things about God certainly depend upon us. Reward and punishment makes that open and shut.
It's like Rosh Chodesh is God's depending on us.
Okay, another example, right. We are the ones that declare when the month should start, and then the holiness of the holidays depends upon when we do that. And I hope you're not misled into thinking that it's the moon that triggers the month. That's simply not true. Yes, we have witnesses who come and say they saw the moon and so forth and so on, but the court has the prerogative to declare the new moon either without the witnesses or against the witnesses. The witnesses can come and give testimony they saw the moon and pass cross-examination, and the court can say, thank you very much, gentlemen. We really appreciate your effort. Rosh Chodesh is tomorrow, not today. We're not doing it. Or they can say, the witnesses haven't come, but we want to start the month today. We're starting it today without the witnesses. They have that. Atem afilu mezidim. They have that power to do it. So really, what starts the month is a decision of the Bezdin, of the court. And then the holiness which comes from God is determined by the decision of the court. That's another example. There are many, many other examples. So, as I said, you could distinguish and put knowledge on one side and action on the other side. And indeed, I think that's what Maimonides does. But it's not obvious. It's not something you could just say, any other possibility is wiped out. Now, Maimonides doesn't tolerate this. Indeed, in the guide, Part 3, Chapter 17, he's discussing there various schools of Arabic philosophy, among other things. And for one of the schools of Arabic philosophy, he says, they happen to believe that God knows everything, including the future, and they believe in man's free will, and a little thought will show you that that's an open contradiction. Don't have to go too deep. You can see for yourself. That's an open contradiction. So people who think he really had a solution in the Mishnah Torah are wrong. He himself says it's an absolute contradiction. So this is why I say what he does, he dissolves it. What he says is this: you're facing a contradiction between two propositions. Suppose I recommend giving up one proposition. Just give it up. then you won't have a contradiction. Well, said Maimonides, I tell you, you can't talk about God, period. All human talk about God is incompetent. It's not true. Our concepts, our ideas, our intuitions, our experiences, none of it applies to God. God is beyond human conception altogether. And that being the case, we can't say that God knows. Of course, we can't say that he's ignorant either. That's also a human description. You can't say he knows. You can't say he's ignorant. You have to do something very un-Jewish. You just have to shut up. Don't talk. Because all your vocabulary is incompetent. One way to explain this idea, I didn't do this last time, but I wanted to explain it, goes back to an idea which modern philosophers are familiar with from Gilbert Ryle in the middle of the 20th century, but really Maimonides has such an example in the guide as well. You take the words we use to describe the world. Each word comes from a certain category of things to which it applies. If you would apply it in the category, you'll either get it right or wrong. But if you apply it outside the category, then you end up talking nonsense. So, for example, let's take green. Well, green applies to the category of physical objects. It applies to the category of which this table is a member. Just happens to be wrong. The table isn't green. Grass is green. The sky is not green. Clouds. But suppose I ask you, what color is the number 6? Green, purple, yellow, orange, magenta, chartreuse. Someone's going to say, no, Rabbi, it's transparent. I don't think that's right either. The number 6? The number 6 doesn't seem to be in the same category. It's not the kind of thing that you can paint, or erase, or, project light onto and get reflections. It's just not a candidate because it's not a physical object. Similarly, you have prime numbers. Certain numbers are prime and certain numbers aren't. But if I use that word, prime, as it's used for numbers and ask, is the table prime? Is the cloud prime? It's a wrong question. Because prime is the quality of numbers, divisible only by itself in 1. Tables aren't divisible at all. Clouds aren't divisible at all. So each word that describes the items in a certain category. Use it outside the category and it becomes meaningless. Now here's the proposition. Every word that we use to describe things comes from a certain category. So we have the category of physical objects, and we have the category of numbers, we have the category of properties, and we have the category perhaps of laws, like physical laws. We have the category of concepts, which is perhaps another category. Let's suppose we have a Q that's outside all the categories. It's not a physical object, it's not a number, it's not a concept, it's not a physical law, it's not a property. Well, if it's outside all the categories, then our words don't apply to it. Would it surprise you to hear that God is not a physical object, and God is not a number, and God is not a property, and God is not a concept, and God is not a law of nature, and so forth and so on? God is simply outside all of our categories, and if he's outside all of our categories, then all of our vocabulary doesn't describe him. Maimonides, this is part 1, chapters 50 through 60 of the guide. Maimonides goes so far, I'm not going to explain this in detail today, but I just want you to know, he goes so far as to say that strictly speaking, you can't say God is 1. Because 1 is a number in a human number system. It's a number that carries a human concept. And you can't even say God exists. Because existence is a human concept, and it's a concept that comes from certain human categories, and God is outside that category as well. You can't talk about God at all. And therefore you can't say that God knows. And since you can't say that God knows, you can't raise the contradiction. How will God's knowledge fit with free will? You can't raise the contradiction because one of the propositions we gave up. Say one more word, and then I'll take a question. And if you will ask, but we have thousands of sentences describing God. Come on, Rabbi, what did you do? You just wiped out 90% of Jewish sources, Jewish literature. Maimonides' answer is that we don't talk about what God is, we talk about what God does. We can talk about his actions. We can't talk about what he is. His actions can be described. And they can be described because he revealed it to us, not because we figured it out. But he described it to us. But that's quite different from describing what he is. Yeah.
Isn't Lashon HaKodesh like a true representation of everything? Meaning, with the right words in Lashon HaKodesh, you would be able to describe Hashem, whatever. Like his 72-letter name is the true description of what it he would be, because the Lashon HaKodesh words are the true essence of what that thing is.
The Lashon HaKodesh is the true essence of every created thing. Every created thing. God is not a created thing. He's a creator. He's beyond language altogether. Even the language that he gave us, Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language, is holy because it describes all the holy things that he created. And the other things it describes in terms of the essence that underlies them. It doesn't follow that it describes him. You know, you have a very interesting, I would say, oblique reference to this. In the Talmud, the names of God are associated with certain qualities of action. The four-letter name, a yud and a hey and a vav and a hey, is associated with mercy. And the five-letter name, aleph lamed hey yud mem, is associated with strict justice, or perhaps with nature, laws of nature. And aleph lamed is associated with loving kindness. So when you read those statements in the Talmud of the Midrash, of which there are hundreds, if not thousands, intuitively what you say to yourself is, okay, this name of God, it's a name of God, the creator, name of the thing behind everything. This name of God is also associated with a certain quality of action. Also, in addition. That's what you say intuitively. Now, the Kabbalah comes along and says, not really. Really, all it's talking about is the quality of action, because that's all there is to talk about. So says the Kabbalah, and so says Maimonides, the philosopher. There's absolute identity of their views in this case. And that's far more common than you are taught to believe by the academics and other people who think that it's two worlds, two philosophies, one coming from Greece and one coming from India, and so on and so on. All that nonsense. The identity between the two of them is nearly complete. There are nuances of difference, but there's a tremendous amount of overlap between the two of them. And here it's absolute. In fact, what Maimonides writes in Part 1, Chapter 54, where this is contained, Ramchal writes in the Klolim Rishonim on the first page, almost word for word. Even uses Maimonides' vocabulary. So, what you're left with is the ability to describe what God does, not what God is, and therefore you have no contradiction. Now, one thing I want to add, we're together so far? Yeah.
Just if we can't describe God in any way, so we're saying God does something, but the word does is used only by things we understand, like something does, a certain action. So if we have no concept of God, how could we say he does something if does is only used by things we understand?
Let's see, you're saying to me that to say X does something, or there is an X doing something, requires me to have some concept of X.
Right.
So I could never be in the position where something happens and I don't know what's causing it. I could never be in that position. Aren't we in that position lots of the time? Something's causing the aurora borealis. What is it? Well, until 20th century, nobody had a clue. There were all these lights in the northern sky. Is it phosphorin gases coming from the ground? Is the sun doing it? Is there some charge? Is there something in the atmosphere that's doing it? Are there microorganisms that we don't see that are burning up in the atmosphere? We had no clue. We just saw it happening. Indeed, what makes the stars shine? We had no clue what stars are. They're just light, 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 light. every day, every generation, every century, every millennium, and still shining and shining and shining. We have no clue what they are. We're very often in a situation where we know what a thing does, and we don't know what it is. Ask quantum mechanics what a photon is. A wavicle, right? Sort of kind of like a wave, kind of like a particle, in the same experiment, not in different experiments. So, I think we're in this situation very, very often. I don't think it's a logical barrier to us at all. A lot of scientific research goes into trying to figure out what the cause is of things that happen.
If you say like God does something, then doesn't that, let's say you say he does a miracle, that means he has the ability to do miracles. So is that describing him when you say he has the ability to do certain things?
Well, I think that since it follows immediately from his doing it, there's nothing left to, you're not adding anything. You're not creating any new information when you say that. He does it, and that's all that's said. But the question will be whether that gives you any conception of what he is. Whatever caused the aurora borealis has the ability to cause the aurora borealis because it causes the aurora borealis. I haven't told you anything about what it is. I give you no information about what it is at all. Just told you again and again, that's what it does. So this is the Rambam's. Now, as I was going to say, and I think maybe it came out now, that there are people who object to this idea on the grounds that it's just a showstopper. You really don't know what you're talking about, Rabbi, and then you put up a veil of ignorance and you say we can't talk about God to just protect yourself, but really you're stuck because you're in an intellectually indefensible position. You're talking about something and you say that you can't say anything positive about it. So you might just as well admit that you're bankrupt, that you can't, that what you're doing is intellectually bankrupt. And I think we're in that situation a lot of the time. I mentioned to you, there's a book called Consciousness Explained by a noted philosopher, Daniel Dennett. Noted is, of course, a public neutral term expressing no evaluation whatsoever. It just is noted. When it was reviewed, I believe it was in the Journal of Philosophy, the reviewer said a better title for the book would have been Consciousness Ignored, because in 350 pages, he didn't discuss the topic. Would you guess they have a disagreement about what consciousness is, huh? That they can't agree on what the subject is? One thinks he's explained it, the other thinks he hasn't even addressed it. So where are we? Well, we're in a situation where nobody can definitely say what we're talking about. That's the way it is with consciousness. Just too bad. As for the present, we need a lot of fundamental work to get to the point where we can. So that's certainly not an objection to where we are. Yeah.
And in the subject of God's will, what would be? I mean, we know what He does.
Okay, so now let's. This is also going a little bit further beyond where I went last time. Let's analyze the concept of action a little bit, because I think maybe we have a too weak, too superficial idea of what an action is. Now let me start with an example. This really goes back to Hilary Putnam and his arguments against behaviorism. You know what it's like for a person to trip and fall. Now, you surely know that there are actors that can act out tripping and falling. And they're so good that if you would watch him, you would think for sure that he tripped and fell by accident. You'd be worried if he was hurt. You'd want to go over and help him. Right? What's the difference? What's the difference between really tripping and falling by accident on the one hand, and an actor who is acting out tripping and falling with the same bodily motions exactly? Same muscles contracting and relaxing. So what's the difference? The difference isn't in the motion of the body. The difference is internal. In the one case, it was a choice. He willed to portray tripping and falling. In the other case, it was no choice at all. It came as a surprise, not connected to his will. So one thing that is required for an action is that it is the result of an act of will. Will has to be involved. Otherwise, it's not an action. If we are being told that we have a description of God's actions, we have a description of something that has divine will in it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a description of an action. Furthermore, every action has a purpose. Every action has a purpose. Even if the purpose was to do this. But it has a purpose. So you see someone's body go through a certain motion, and you ask him, why did you do that? And he says, wrong question. Wrong question. Irrelevant question. Why doesn't apply? What he's telling you was, it was a muscle twitch. It was a loss of control. It wasn't an action at all. If the question why is rejected as an irrelevant question, what you're being told is that what happened wasn't an action. If it was an action, the question why applies, and there has to be an answer. Even if he says, my purpose in doing it was to do it. That is also a purpose. I did it to do it, nothing else. So in order to get a description of God's actions, I have to get a description of his will and his purposes. And he gives us that. He gives us that. All of that is contained in the description of what he does, which we are given and we can understand. We can understand it because he describes it to us that way. But the nature of the agent behind the action, that we don't have. That we don't have. A little bit of analogy. In the ancient world, there were places that understood the brain. What does the brain do? The brain is a radiator. Think of all the surface area. In that volume, you have a gigantic amount of surface area. That's how you radiate lots of heat. You get rid of heat through your head, right? Thinking in the middle of your chest. After all, when you think an exciting thought, you feel the response in your heart, don't you? You feel your heart beats faster, right? You don't feel any response up here. You don't even itch, right? It's just nothing, zero. Complete emptiness. Nothing goes on up there. They had no idea that the brain was for thinking. Does that mean that we don't relate to people as people, that we can't understand what they want and the content of their thoughts and so on? No, we just had a wrong idea of what physical organ supports the thinking. So the idea that you need to have knowledge of what's doing it in order to understand it as doing it, that the doing is something that it did, is simply not correct. So that's how we end up with the question of foreknowledge of free will. There's a solution, and there's a way to dissolve the problem. Both of which are represented in the tradition. And by the way, I want to make clear, someone asked me this last time and I didn't have a chance to say it. What's the relationship between Maimonides' position and the solution that we started with? You have to be very careful. Maimonides rejects the solution on the grounds that the solution starts by saying God's knowledge depends upon our choice. And he's not willing to accept that. But Maimonides can agree with the logic in the solution. Maimonides can say, if I were wrong about this, if it were acceptable that God's knowledge should depend upon our choice, then the rest of your logic is perfectly correct. I disagree with your position at the top, but the logic following from your assumption is perfectly good logic, and it does, in fact, solve the problem, given that assumption. So I think that this is a problem for which we do not have too much worry. And I did point out last time, I think it's also quite, I didn't think of this till a couple of years ago. I've been teaching this for a long time, since I'm 106 years old. The language which describes God's knowledge of the future in our literature is the language of perception. Hakol tzafui v'rashus desuna. Everything is foreseen. And yet power is given to make our own choices. Sofa Maseim shel tzadikim, Maseim shel roshoim. God foresaw the actions of the righteous and the wicked in the future. It's a language of seeing. I think that lends support from the tradition to the idea of those who present the solution. It's presented as a kind of seeing. Well, seeing is reactive. Seeing gives you information from what you observe, where the fact starts from the thing that you observe. It's not a proof, because the word see can sometimes connote understanding. But we have lots of words for understanding. Yodea, and Chochmah, and Das, and Haskel, we have lots of words for understanding. And for the Rabbinic literature to pick out specifically words of perception, I think counts for evidence. Nevertheless, Maimonides won't go there. He won't accept it. Okay? We're satisfied? Okay, now we're in part 2, chapter 2. I'll just give you an introduction today to the next piece of his discussion. We're talking about man's place in the world, his challenges in the world, what he needs to accomplish, what counts as success and failure, what the consequences of success and failure are. And the basic dynamic is that there are mitzvos and averos, commandments and prohibitions. And doing mitzvos, as we said, generates reward, and doing the averos generates punishment. And everything in this world, the preparation to go into the next world. We started off, when we learned the book, we learned that in chapter 2. And the next world is wholly good. It's wholly good. No evil can exist in the next world. Evil exists in this world. It exists as a potentiality in order to make free will possible. Free will then can be used to realize the potentiality, but the next world is wholly good. So the question that has to be dealt with is, what about the evil in this world that gets realized through human free will? What about that evil? What happens to it? I told you, we quoted this from the book once already, and he says it several other times, that the world to come includes everything there is in this world, even the mosquitoes. Doesn't that make you joyful? Everything goes in because everything gets perfected. So we're not talking about obliteration. No category is missing. So in that case, what happens to the evil? Something has to happen to make sure that when we get into the world to come, there's no evil left. It's got to be something that's some way that's required to rid the creation of evil. And as he said at the beginning of chapter 1, that there are two modes to this. One is for each individual, and the other is for mankind as a whole. And he said because there's free will, there is the potentiality of evil built in throughout the system. This problem has to be solved. Yeah.
Isn't it two things? Firstly, that evil had its purpose only to get you to the complete good, and completed that once you get to the complete good. And also, since there's no need for free choice up there, there's no need for the evil, because that's what creates our free choice.
Correct. But I'm not quite understood the first thing you said. What did you say?
It had its purpose to get us to the level of good.
Right. No one is suggesting that there shouldn't be evil. In fact, as I pointed out, we're not saying that evil is good. That's just an open contradiction. But evil could be necessary. This we did say. And since it's the incompleteness of things that often leads to their being imperfect. I pointed out, if you buy your child a jigsaw puzzle of 100 pieces, loose in the box, there's no picture in the box, just loose pieces. You don't complain and say, well, what a mess. Why did they put it together? Would have been a picture then. No, it's perfect because it's loose and not a picture, because it's a puzzle. It's perfect for its job. Its job is to test the child's ability to put together a puzzle. So the very fact that it's incomplete, as a picture it's incomplete, as a picture it's not realized, but it's perfect for its purpose. The purpose is to give the child a challenge. So the existence of evil in our world, this is another way of putting your point, the existence of evil in our world is perfect for our world, is perfect for our world in its very internal imperfection, because that leaves room for human beings to perfect the world. The world were created perfect, and we know nothing for us to do. But since the purpose of evil is to make possible free choice, and as you correctly pointed out, in the world to come there is no free choice, the choosing is over, there's no place for evil in the world. Now, but we, by our choices, make things evil. What happens to those things? Not only the things in the world around us, but also we make ourselves. We give ourselves evil marks from our actions, which have to be handled in one way or another. And the whole thing has to be handled in a way that's just, that compensates a person fairly for the things that he does. And that's what he comes on to describe in this next section. Those things. Okay.